Start with contracting sprites. Chapter 31. Su Hao carried a thick book, the pre-assessment guide for sprite cultivators, in his arms. He was revising right now. His eyes were spinning from reading the book. This is so tough. Why are my intelligence points not increasing at all? This guidebook sucks. Nearby, Silkworm Baby was training on its own. Step 1. Discharge your spiritual force and maintain this state for a while. Silkworm Baby understood this part. Step 2. Physically manifest the discharged spiritual force. Silkworm Baby spat out a ray of spiritual force light dots. The ray was as long as an arm. The light dots congregated, just like a transparent glass tube which trapped the mischievous light dots within. Silkworm Baby wanted to compress them further and turn the dispersed dots into a solid state. All of a sudden, the specks of excessively compressed spiritual force erupted with a pop. The explosion caused all the leaves on the ground to fly about, covering Silkworm Baby's entire face. There was a dazed look on its face, while a few leaves sat in its slightly ajar mouth. A light breeze blew past. A leaf drifted in the wind and covered its eyes. Su Hao burst into laughter. He hurriedly tried to hold his laughter in, but he still couldn't contain it in the end. Pfft, ha ha ha. Usually, he wouldn't have laughed, but Silkworm Baby was seriously and earnestly pretending to contemplate and analyze what had happened, even though there was a leaf plastered to its face right now. It was more than what Su Hao could handle. Gurgle. Bang. 5 minutes later, Su Hao had no choice but to put down the book in his hand, roll up his sleeves, and step forward personally to advise Silkworm Baby in its training. Granule machine gun is the easiest to master. You should start with the simplest one. Gurgle. Silkworm I have met with an obstacle. Baby reluctantly agreed. This move was a little similar to spraying out spiritual force. Silkworm Baby had already had a lot of practice with that, so it went straight ahead to try it out. After only 3 hours. Gurgle. Its mouth formed a circle. Then, specks of light the size of rice grains sprayed from its mouth, forming a green beam of light that blasted a large tree nearby. Countless granules ravaged the poor unfortunate tree like a gale in a storm, crackling loudly as they did so. Tree bark was blasted off the trunk amidst loud snaps. The tree was covered in hundreds and thousands of holes. 2 seconds later, the whole tree broke and landed with a crash. Cough, cough, cough. Clouds of dust swirled around the place, causing Su Hao to cover his nose and mouth. Seems like we went a little overboard. Ever since the start of Silkworm Baby's training, the trees and plants at the back of Lake East Hill had been suffering a lot of destruction. It wasn't so bad in the past, because there was a limit to Silkworm Baby's destructive power. But now? At the rate of 1 tree per move, wouldn't this place become desolate after a while? What a sin, what a sin. Silky, looks like we can't use the trees and plants as targets anymore. Let's use that large rock over there instead. Use that as a target to bring up your proficiency with granule machine gun. Large rock. Silkworm Baby, which had just learned a new unique skill, was very enthusiastic. In the future, it would really be able to convince people with its mouth. After adjusting its angle and accumulating spiritual force, a green light beam shot out of its mouth. Countless granules went pitter-patter as they struck the large rock, causing bits of rock to fly about haphazardly. However, the large rock survived tenaciously, just that its surface was now somewhat peppered with holes and gaps. Su Hao was very satisfied. They would be able to use this target for a very long period of time. He picked up the guidebook again, not forgetting to leave instructions as he did so. Keep at it. This is the only move to practice for the afternoon. When your spiritual force is depleted, go on to physical training. I, your owner, am revising so diligently. As my sprite, you must also be equally serious. Silkworm Baby. We're not the same, all right. Gurgle. Rising at sunrise and resting at sunset, Post-transmigration Su Hao was a lot more hardworking than what he was in the past. He needed to attend his classes for academic subjects, but he also needed to prepare for the Sprite Cultivator assessment and supervise Silkworm Baby's training. I'm seriously amazing. My favorite novels, anime, and comics, and games. I've not touched them for a week. October 22nd, Tuesday. Su Hao, Sprite Trainer intern. Intelligence points, 73. Soul power, 7.69, 6.55. Contracted Sprite, S Silkworm Baby, pre-entry level, spiritual force, 80. Unlocked cultivation plan, S Silkworm Baby basic cultivation, Silkworm Baby spiritual force enhancement cultivation. Unlocked unique skill, S charging, roaring, granule machine gun, energy ball, Silkworm Baby's progression rate, 80%, string shot, Silkworm Baby's progression rate. Chapter 32. Su Hao carried out the excellent tradition of an examination candidate when he received the test paper. He schemed through all the questions from the start to the end. And then, he realized that it seemed like he vaguely understood them. It was doable, not too difficult, and a little easy. Something wasn't quite right. Question 1. How many colors are there in a fiery jay's feathers? And where are the colors distributed? Answer. There are 3 colors in a fiery jay's feathers: white, red, and black. Out of which, the forehead and a ring around the neck are red. The white feathers are. And the rest are black. Without even a second thought, Su Hao wrote his answers down right away. Papers rustled as he flipped page after page. Before long, I'm actually done. There were quite a number of questions in the Sprite Cultivator assessment test. They made up a good 8 pages. In addition, most of them were free response questions, so it was very time-consuming to answer them. However, Su Hao practically didn't even pause when he was writing his answers. It was only when he was done that he realized that his hand was tired, very much so. He lifted his arm and looked at the time. Only half the duration had passed. I'm actually this powerful? No, this isn't right. The elimination rate of the Sprite Cultivator license assessment is extremely high every year. Just the written test alone could eliminate nearly 90% of the candidates. How can the test questions be this easy? There must be a trap hidden somewhere. It's very easy for those who aren't meticulous enough to lose marks. Su Hao felt like he had discovered the truth. He flipped back to the first page of the test paper and checked through his answers one by one. He checked again and again, not letting go of even a single punctuation mark. On the platform, when the invigilator noticed Su Hao frowning as he flipped and went through his test paper, he couldn't help but chuckle and shake his head. The Sprite Cultivator assessment was simply too difficult for a high school student. Taking part in the written test was nothing more than just familiarizing oneself with the procedures. Nevertheless, the invigilator was still very appreciative of students who had drawn up their future plans at such a young age. Arring. Time's up. Candidates in the first row, please help to collect the test papers. All right, all of you may leave now. Su Hao packed his bag and walked out of the classroom. The sunlight outside was bright and piercing. Around him were examination candidates with miserable looks on their faces. The questions this time seemed even harder. I'm only confident in 2/3 of my answers. Looks like it's hard to say how it'll go. There are too many questions. I still had 3 questions to go when time was up. How many holes are there on a little charcoal tortoise's shell? What the hell, I have a little tortoise at home, but I've never taken any notice of this in the past. How exactly is that question about the toxic hunting spider supposed to be answered? I still can't think of any situation where the toxic hunting spider will be poisoned by itself. A chaotic mix of voices rang out continuously around him. Su Hao's action of slinging his backpack onto his shoulders was a little stiff. A question mark slowly popped up above his head. Were we not doing the same set of questions? No, the questions were the same. But there were actually people who couldn't come up with the answer that there were 3 pairs of symmetrical holes respectively on the left and right of the little charcoal tortoise's shell. He even knew that the holes were a medium through which the little charcoal tortoise absorbed and discharged energy. Its function was similar to the green patterns on silkworm baby's back. Even the lists of key points in basic cultivation plans would mention something as simple as this. Su Hao didn't understand at all. Didn't any of them revise at all? Maybe I happened to meet a bunch of mediocre students? There were quite a number of such candidates in the assessments every year. Without an enormous candidate pool, how could the excellence of qualified candidates stand out? There was no pleasure without comparison. Even if this was just a bunch of mediocre students, Su Hao's nerves calmed down significantly nonetheless. At least I managed to finish all the questions. The probability of passing the written test. It should be all right, I guess. When he got home, what Su Hao saw was a diligent little silkworm baby. It was currently practicing with the spiritual force ball. Let me check your progress. Su Hao checked the spiritual force ball. The highest record displayed was 75 points for hard level. Previously, it was only 72 points. Not bad. Looks like you haven't been slacking off. Gurgle. Silkworm baby peeked at the computer, which was already switched off. Then, it stared hard at a novel and worked on learning to become a new age silkworm baby of culture. 3 days passed in the blink of an eye. On Friday, at 11 a.m., was when the results of the written test, the first round of the Sprite Cultivator assessment, would be announced. Su Hao was still in school. He took advantage of a break during training to sneak out secretly and accessed the official website on his cell phone right away. It was mildly overloaded. The total score of the written test is 200 marks. As long as you can get 150 marks and above, you'll be considered as having passed. Through the comparison with the few mediocre students, Su Hao's confidence had already risen from slightly low to medium level. He should be able to score 150 marks and above. Su Hao swiftly keyed in his name and candidate registration number. The nervousness came over him as he stared at the loading page. Suddenly, the page loaded. There were only 2 very simple lines of text there. The first line was his name, Su Hao. The other line was his score, 192 marks. What the f***ck? Su Hao's eyes widened. He repeatedly checked whether or not he had accessed the wrong site, or keyed in the wrong candidate registration number, or saw the wrong name. His heart pounded loudly. All his nervousness and worry culminated into a single sentence in the end: I'm actually this outstanding. What's so outstanding? Su Hao, how can you be so narcissistic? A voice that came out of the blue gave him a fright. It was then that he discovered that Lu Ren, the pancake face, had already leaned in right beside him, and was less than a palm's distance away from him. What the f***ck? At once, Su Hao used continuous backward jump and zoomed backward more than 10 meters away. Nevertheless, Lu Ren managed to see the website. Sprite Cultivator License Assessment, 192 marks. 192. 109 et. What the f***ck? Su Hao, you scored close to full marks. Lu Ren approached him at the speed of charging. He took the cell phone from the dazed Su Hao and took a look. Then, he erupted into a shout that was akin to roaring. What the f***ck? Chatterbox Lu, becoming aware of the news, was equivalent to the whole class becoming aware of it. Naturally, when the whole class was aware of it, in no time, the entire student body of the Sprite stream became aware that Su Hao had scored an ultra-high score in the written test of the Sprite stream assessment. It's that Su Hao. Is there a second big boss Su here? Doesn't Su Hao achieving such a high score in the written test mean that there's hope for him in successfully getting an official Sprite Cultivator license? You can even get bonus marks with that in the college entrance examination. Looks like Su Hao will be able to enroll in a key Sprite university this year. Despite knowing that the license could give 1 bonus marks, no one went to take the assessment. Why was that? Because it was too difficult. Investing one's limited energy into the Sprite Cultivator assessment when the passing rate was so low was a loss. A key university. Lu Ren shook his head. Do you know what being an official Sprite Cultivator signifies? Bonus marks aside, Su Hao has already nurtured Silkworm Baby into such a strong Sprite. There's hope for him to enroll even into a famous and prestigious school, much less a key university. A prestigious school. City First High might not be able to come up with even a single student who could enroll in a prestigious Sprite school in a whole batch of students. Even Gulinjao, who was reputed to be an important seedling, was merely said to have a chance at doing so. Could it be that Su Hao was more skilled than even Gulinjao? But wasn't he from a regular family background? Many students couldn't help looking at Su Hao, who was standing nearby. Gulinjao had also heard the news. Her eyes were bright and shining. She said, I heard from my uncle that the Sprite Cultivator license assessment is especially tough. Su Hao, you've been studying for a really long time, right? You must have been preparing since you were in junior high. No wonder you could nurture Silkworm Baby so well. A lot of people held doubts about Chatterbox Liu's words. But now that even Gulinjao said so, they believed the news right away. Big Boss Su was truly impressive. They were schoolmates with someone from a prestigious school. People's gazes shifted over to him one by one. Su Hao touched the tip of his nose. Seriously, was he that kind of person who loved to show off? Low profile, have all of you heard of something called being low profile? Su Hao hadn't mentioned it previously because he was afraid that he would score too low. He couldn't afford to embarrass himself like that. As for now, his score was high anyway. Even if he couldn't pass the second round, he would still be just as outstanding. Since they now knew, then so be it. After all, the feeling that those looks of admiration and envy brought Su Hao felt pretty good. Chapter 33. The second round of the Sprite Cultivator assessment was held the next day. The examination venue for candidates of An City and its other three sister cities was set in the Association of Sprite Cultivators in Yunhua City. Su Hao packed his luggage, intending to set off for Yunhua City on Friday evening. Both his parents needed to work on Saturday. They could only let Su Hao head there by himself despite their worry. However, remember to take good care of Silkworm Baby. It's alright if you starve, but you can't let little baby starve. Understand? Su Hao was bewildered. He could only stretch his evil hand out toward Silkworm Baby and leave with a silkworm piggy in his grasp. Gurgle. Silkworm Baby was reluctant to leave. Why? Shouldn't it stay home while Su Hao went for the assessment? Why did it have to go with him? It didn't need Su Hao to take care of it at all, right. Unfortunately, it couldn't win Su Hao in an argument, much less his parents. Thus, while hanging its head, it was brought onto the bus by Su Hao. From the bus stop, he took the bus to Yunhua City. After he alighted, he headed to the hotel near the Association of Sprite Cultivators in Yunhua City. By the time Su Hao reached, it was already 8 to 9 o'clock at night. The association was very generous. They provided hotel accommodation, and single rooms at that, for all the candidates. Good thing it's a single room. Otherwise, I'd rather find another place to stay at than share a room with a stranger. The hotel was putting up only examination candidates for today. After providing his candidate information, Su Hao checked in. In the grand lobby, he saw a lot of examination candidates. Like the other time at the written test, there were both men and women, young and old. The number of candidates that made it for the second round this time exceeds 300. I feel like it's hard to tell what will happen again this year. It can't be, there were only 286 people during the March session. Why is this session harder? This is already my third attempt. A middle-aged man, who was originally silent, sneered. Third attempt? You're already at your limit during the third attempt? I'll tell you, I've been trying to get my Sprite Cultivator license for 8 years. I'd already passed the written test during the second year, but even all the way until the March session, I was still eliminated during the second round. Surely not. The candidate, who looked to be a college student, was a little scared now. Is the passing rate that low? The middle-aged man replied, I'll put it this way, in the last few years, only 4 to 5 people received their licenses per session. During the last couple of years, there were a few more people, 11 to 12 people managed to pass. But the number of people participating in the second round. He laughed self-mockingly. If I still can't pass this time, I'm not going to bother anymore. Although applying to become a Sprite cultivator isn't as expensive as rearing sprites, if one doesn't put in their full effort into exam preparation, there's no chance of passing at all. All these years, in order to help me get my Sprite cultivator license, my family has tightened their purse strings a lot. I've also thought it through. Perhaps this isn't meant to be. Even if I can't become a Sprite cultivator, I can still work and earn a living. I can't hold my family back like that anymore. He spoke as though he had already accepted it, but his smile was rather forced. There was unconcealable dejection at the bottom of his eyes. Reality was brutal. People saw only the glory of Sprite trainers and Sprite cultivators, but they tended to overlook the hardships and diligence behind the scenes. Fighting so hard for so many years, only to end up with nothing at all in the end. There were quite a lot of people like the middle-aged man among the examination candidates. The few younger ones, and those whose families were a bit more well-off, couldn't help but become somewhat melancholic. Many years down the road, would they also be like this middle-aged man, hiding their sorrow in their heart? Influenced by the atmosphere, Silkworm Baby also became a lot more dejected. Su Hao was so stupid. What if the assessment made him cry? Gurgle. It patted Su Hao's head and comforted him softly. Su Hao didn't know whether to laugh or to cry. He hadn't even sat for the examination yet. The middle-aged man noticed Su Hao. Young man, are you also here for the Sprite Cultivator assessment? You're a high school student, aren't you? How impressive. The college student said, I also applied for the Sprite Cultivator assessment when I was in high school, but I couldn't even score half the total marks in the written test and ended up being completely traumatized. I only dared to apply again after taking a break for quite a few years. The middle-aged man seemed to have let go a lot more after he accepted his fate. He wasn't as cold and distant as he was in the beginning anymore. He said in persuasion, third-year high school students like you should still focus on nurturing your sprites. You can apply for a Sprite cultivator license anytime you want in the future, but once you miss out on the Sprite University, the price you have to pay would be too high. Su Hao understood that the middle-aged man had kind intentions. Although he didn't have high hopes for himself, to a third-year high school student who was charging full force toward a Sprite University, it was indeed not worth applying for a Sprite cultivator license. The risk was too great, while the benefits were average. It was only because he didn't spend much time on revision and was only applying for the license casually, as well as the fact that Silkworm Baby could finish its training tasks on time even without supervision, that Su Hao could go for the assessment without worry. But this only applies to ordinary people like us. Geniuses are in a different league. The middle-aged man went on. Do you know? Among the candidates of the second round this time, the youngest is only 14 years old. And not just that, he even scored full marks for the written test. He's practically already reserved a passing slot. You don't believe me? The middle-aged man shook his head. Ask around even a little, and you'll know. His name is Ai Zishi. Not only is he incredibly talented, but his teacher is also Master Chen Ping. He's from a different world altogether right from the start. That Master Chen, who's honored as the pioneer of evolution because he discovered 18 new sprite evolution pathways in his research, Master Chen Ping. Yes, that exact Master Chen. No wonder. If it's Master Chen's disciple, it's not surprising that he could score full marks for his written test. Are there any other candidates who are difficult to handle other than AI Zishi? The middle-aged man burst into laughter. Don't you think that's enough? AI Zishi alone has already reserved a slot. If there are any others, we won't need to take the assessment anymore. But, he said, there aren't any other famous ones, but from what I understand, other than AI Zishi who scored full marks, there are also a few other candidates who scored more than 190 marks in the written test this time. There are seriously too many strong opponents. The college student asked feebly, I scored 173 marks for my written test. That's 23 marks higher than the passing mark. That should be enough, right? Another person sneered. I got 178 marks in the written test. So sorry, but I got 179. The middle-aged man smiled self-mockingly. I got 183 marks, but that's only because I've taken the test too many times, so I have a lot of experience. The test questions for the second round are completely randomly given by the examiner squad. In fact, every session's test questions are different. Despite his self-mockery, the way everyone looked at the middle-aged man had changed nevertheless. He was a strong opponent. Perhaps he was merely a hair's breadth away from getting the license. Young man, how many marks did you get? Asked the middle-aged man. It was only after the question left his mouth that he changed his tone and said, the written test score isn't important. You're still young, just take it as familiarizing yourself with the procedures. Taking your time to get the Sprite Cultivator license after you've enrolled in a Sprite university and become an official Sprite Trainer isn't bad either. Su Hao was rather hesitant. The middle-aged man had given him a lot of examination hall-related information. It seemed rather disrespectful if he kept his score a secret. After thinking about it, he still said it in the end. Just 192 marks. The middle-aged man was rendered speechless. The college student was rendered speechless. The male candidate was rendered speechless. The female candidate was rendered speechless. They'd originally thought that all of them here were low-level players. They didn't expect that a king like him was hidden among them. The atmosphere turned awkward at once. Chapter 34. Early in the morning the next day, Su Hao left Silkworm Baby by itself to look after the luggage and headed to the Association of Sprite Cultivators less than 500 meters away from the hotel. Sprites were forbidden in the examination hall of the second round, after all. The examination hall was in a lecture hall-like room in the main building of the association. Even though it was very spacious and could accommodate 500 to 600 students for a lecture, as an examination hall for 300-odd students, it was still rather packed. All the seats to both Su Hao's left and right were filled with people. He was aware of the reason, however. The day before, he had gotten to know from the middle-aged man that the second round of the examination employed a real-time elimination system. The examiner would set the test questions randomly. After the candidates answered, they would give out the assessment grade on the spot. A number of people would be eliminated per round. It might look crowded now, but before long, the examination hall wouldn't be left with many candidates. But aren't they concerned about people cheating and peeking at others when everyone is seated so closely? Su Hao got his answer very quickly. The big shots from the examiner squad, a head examiner and a few deputy examiners, made their way in. He didn't know any of the examiners, but he did know the sprite that was following by the side of one of the examiners, a spiritual eye. This was a light element sprite. It looked like a gigantic eye, as though a balloon with an eyeball drawn on it. It was all puffed up. Below the eye, red, blue, green, and purple ribbons drifted and danced about despite the lack of wind. This allowed the spiritual eye to float in mid-air, its size a whole notch taller than the examiner's. So it's the spiritual eye that's known as the Eye of Heaven. No wonder they aren't concerned about candidates cheating. This sprite species was rare, and it was also one under the Dragon Nation's control. Su Hao observed that this particular spiritual eye possessed elite-level strength. Don't be fooled by how big of a number 300-odd candidates seemed to be under the watch of spiritual eye, not a single tiny action could get past it. As the examination hadn't started, Su Hao observed the other candidates boldly with peace of mind. The examination hall was in the shape of a semicircle. All the seats surrounded the region in the absolute center where the examiners were. His seat was in the third row on the left. It was relatively nearer to the front. Su Hao spotted the middle-aged man in the fourth row opposite him. The man noticed him as well and gave him a smile. That's Ai Zishi. There was an especially eye-catching candidate in the middle of the first row. He was of small stature and had a childlike face. Amidst candidates mainly made up of weary-looking young adults and greasy middle-aged adults, he was especially eye-catching. Su Hao was eye-catching as well, of course. He sensed other people's attention on him all the time. However, he wasn't the only high school student there. Su Hao also spotted a candidate who was wearing a school uniform. Quieten down, we're commencing the second round of the Sprite Cultivator assessment now. All candidates, straighten your posture and remain silent. Everything you do will be under the watch of spiritual eye. Anyone found cheating will be thrown out of the examination hall and their application eligibility disqualified for the next 3 years. All right, you may begin with the first question now. The imposing head examiner sat back onto his seat. A deputy examiner walked to the back of the examiner's seats where the wall was. There was a large door there. He opened the door. 3 sprites filed into the examination hall. The one in the lead was a sprite that was very commonly seen, a grassland wolf. The second was also a common sprite, a little ground wolf. The third was a canine-type sprite mixed in with the 2 wolves. Its fur coat was black and shiny, and there was even a somewhat indistinct fiery red pattern on it. It was a flame-patterned hound. This was a rare sprite. The deputy examiner announced, Question 1, state the spiritual force values of the 3 sprites. Those whose error margin exceeds 15 in total will be eliminated. You have a minute, starting now. In other words, the error margin in spiritual force value evaluation per sprite must be 5 points or less. Was it supposed to be this easy? If the error margin was 0.5, Su Hao wouldn't have any confidence either. But an error margin of 5 was so generous, didn't that mean that any random answer would do? Oh well, this was just the first question, after all. Su Hao observed the sprites. All 3 sprites were obviously pre-entry level. The strongest among them was undoubtedly the flame-patterned hound. The luster of its fur coat was bright and shiny, and the fiery red patterns on its fur were already close to linking into a ring. Even its eyes contained a sense of haughtiness when it looked at the 2 wolves. Su Hao wrote a few numbers on the answer board provided in the examination hall. Spiritual force, 99. The values he wrote for the grassland wolf and little ground wolf were 78 and 45, respectively. He wrote the numbers down swiftly after taking a couple of looks. At this point, less than 10 seconds had even passed. A solemn atmosphere filled the examination hall. The candidates widened their eyes and observed the 3 sprites as best as possible, hoping to assess their current standard from the small and subtle characteristics and differences. But this was simply too difficult. They were allowed to only observe from a distance and couldn't even touch them. Also, they only had a minute to boot. Tick-tock, tick-tock. Some of the candidates broke into a cold sweat. Their eyes were tired and weary, but they didn't dare to blink, much less rub their eyes. At this point, an examiner spoke. 10 seconds left. 5 seconds. All right, pens down. Several candidates filled in a random numerical value with their trembling hands at the very last moment. After that, they, who were in high concentration mode and holding their breaths during the observation process, finally took a harsh breath of air. Announcing the answers now. Pictures of the 3 sprites and their corresponding numerical values were displayed on the big screen behind the examiner's seats. Several candidates turned ghastly pale the moment they looked at it. At the same time, a piercing red light lit up the answer boards in front of them. Candidates who have been eliminated, please leave the hall quietly and orderly. Soft sobbing could be heard in the silent examination hall. Su Hao sighed lightly. This was the brutality of the Sprite Cultivator assessment. 1 minute into the examination and half the candidates were eliminated. Candidates, who were dejected, in disbelief, or in grief, got up from their seats and walked out of the examination hall, as though they were soulless. All the candidates to Su Hao's left, right, and center front were eliminated. His surroundings became a lot more spacious right away. All of a sudden. Bang! A candidate slammed his palm on the desk. With his head raised defiantly, he said, "I clearly have an error margin of only 6. Why have I been eliminated too? This exam is rigged." Rigged. He was so furious that his eyes were red and his neck thick. However, Su Hao discovered that his eyes were a little shifty. A deputy examiner let out a cold chuckle. At the 23rd second of the examination, you turned your head to the left. At the 42nd second, you peeked at the person to your right. Don't you have any idea whether or not your answer truly belongs to you? I'm not. I didn't. The young adult turned toward the other candidates, attempting to find people in the same situation as him. However, apart from his own voice, there was only pin-drop silence in the examination hall. Experienced candidates shook their heads slightly, with looks of pity on their faces. The deputy examiner said, "Throw him out. For disturbing the order of the examination hall, your assessment eligibility is disqualified for life." "Wait, no, I..." The young man was scared now. But right away, 2 security officers had charged in. With one on the left and one on the right, they held him and even covered his mouth. Then, they dragged him out in a clean and smooth motion. A few candidates who were intending to voice their support shut their mouths immediately. With their heads lowered, they quickened their pace and walked out of the examination hall. When all the eliminated candidates had left, the head examiner said, "Begin with the second question." The 3 sprites left. New sprites entered. Different questions and different requests came from the examiners. They became trickier, more and more difficult, and more uncommon. Yet the amount of time given remained just as short. 5 rounds of questions later, only a small number of candidates were left in the examination hall. Su Hao took advantage of the brief moment when candidates were leaving the hall to take a quick look around. There were only 29 people left. The middle-aged uncle has also managed to hang in there. To the candidates, the second round was no different from a test of perseverance. Whoever was able to persevere till the end would be the winner. As a white-headed little tortoise sashayed to the front of the stage, the imposing head examiner stood and announced something. "Round 6, please draw up a cultivation plan suitable for this white-headed tortoise. You have 10 minutes. Chapter 35. Here it comes, the key question. Many candidates' hearts tightened. The job of a sprite cultivator was to design cultivation plans for sprites. Therefore, in the second round of examination, there ought to be a question on a cultivation plan. It was also the only predictable question in the whole second round. But even so, this question was still not easy. On the contrary, it was extremely difficult. If sprite cultivation plans could be designed by just revising, researching, and memorizing, what did people need sprite cultivators for? The compatibility of the plan to the sprite was key. Su Hao focused his gaze and looked at the sprite. The appearance of the white-headed tortoise gradually enlarged in his eyes. Sprite, white-headed tortoise. Basic information, water element, growth stage. Introduction: this is an overnourished white-headed tortoise. Because it ate too much food containing spiritual force that cannot be fully digested, this white-headed tortoise is overly energetic, and its limbs show subtle incongruity. Detailed information, unlock with 1 intelligence point. Indeed, it's pretty similar to my judgment. It's the interface indeed. The key to this question is that this white-headed tortoise is overnourished. Even if one revised other cultivation plans of white-headed tortoises, if they dared using it on this white-headed tortoise, they would definitely die badly. Su Hao touched his chin and only thought briefly. Before starting to type on the answer tablet, one could also choose to write with a tablet pen. A brief cultivation plan would take at least hundreds of characters, either typing or handwriting took time. 10 minutes made it seem like the question with the longest time. But in fact, the time was still very short. There wasn't much time to be wasted. The whole examination room was quiet again, with only slight sounds of fingers tapping on the answer tablet. 10 minutes passed in a blink, and the answers were directly sent to the examiners. For this round, the reviewing took some time. This was also the reason the cultivation plan question was in the 6th round. It was too troublesome to review more than 300 candidates' answers, but reviewing 29 candidates was much easier. All the examiners at the examiners' table were Sprite cultivators with much experience and relatively high positions. They came from the Sprite Cultivator associations of Yunhua City and nearby cities. The deputy examiners cross-reviewed in groups of 2, and in the end, the head examiner did the final check. This batch of candidates performed pretty well. The head examiner checked through the examination papers. Su, 83 marks. Yang Donghai, 82 marks. Zhang Lingkai, 79 marks. Ai Zishi, 97 marks. The examiner team had an experienced Sprite cultivator, and their opinions were pretty much similar. Thus, the head examiner would only occasionally raise or lower 1 point for a candidate. Suddenly, the head examiner was stunned. He saw that on a candidate's answer sheet, the marking column was actually filled with A, by both examiners. Do you want to be fired? The head examiner frowned, feeling that things were not so simple, so he patiently continued looking down. This answer was rich in content, and actually broke down into ordinary, medium, and advanced plans based on the number of cultivation resources available. Does it have the real stuff or just a gimmick? The examiner glanced only once and determined that it was an answer that had real stuff. But his look fell on a line. Mash hollowed tree stumps and grind into powder, mix with elemental water spiritual liquid and let the white-headed tortoise take it, and use vortex methods to let the white-headed tortoise train in water, which can improve and accelerate its absorption of spiritual force. There was the comment from the deputy examiner at the side. A was given beside hollowed tree stumps and elemental water spiritual liquid, questioning the feasibility of the formula. If not for the clear argumentation and well-founded evidence in front, the head examiner would only take this kind of method as nonsense. But now, he kept simulating the effect of these two supplements and felt that it might not be entirely unfeasible. For a moment, he couldn't decide. As the examiners reviewed the answers, the candidates sitting on their seats could only wait anxiously. At this round, it was almost the last step to getting the certificate. However, if they were eliminated, they would be the same as those who left in the first round, and those who couldn't pass the written test all losers. They waited and waited, scratched their heads, and looked at their watches. Experienced old candidates fell into contemplation. Why is the examiner's review taking so long today? In previous times, it was done at a maximum of 10 minutes. Now, 20 minutes have passed, and the examiners are still communicating in low voices. Wait. Communicating? A candidate discovered the blind spot. Could it be that Ai Zishi's plan was too excellent that the examiners can't decide whether to give him a full mark or to deduct 1 mark and give him 99 to prevent him from being too proud? Soon, the examiners finally returned to their seats. But the examinees got no marks. They only heard the head examiner ask, "Who is Su Hao?" Su Hao stood up reflexively. His look was completely confused. There's still an on-spot questioning part for the second round? Why didn't the uncle talk about it? Oh, it's possible that uncle didn't manage to stay till this round previously. The head examiner didn't waste any time and went right to the point. What's your supporting evidence for choosing hollowed tree stumps? Su Hao didn't think much. The examiners are all mid-level or advanced level sprite cultivators, all big bosses. How can they possibly not understand the plans written by me, a newbie? It must be that I didn't write it in enough detail. Thank you, big boss examiners, for giving me an opportunity to continue answering. Teachers, this is how I considered it. Hollowed tree stumps are usually used on wood element sprites, and water element sprites absorb them with poor effectiveness. However, they can be dissolved into elemental water spiritual liquid, used as an accompanying medicinal liquid for the vortex training method to allow the white-headed tortoise to absorb the extra nutrients in its body at a faster speed, and release the impurities. And this point just needs to make use of the white-headed tortoise's repellents of hollowed tree stumps. Besides, this white-headed tortoise is overnourished because it took in too many spiritual items at once, not because it consumed jade powder without related training over a long time. That's why this plan is feasible. If its overnourishment caused in the long term, it would be more troublesome to deal with. A cost-effective plan would take 1 month, the main method being. I think a medium plan is. If one is not short on money, then the problem of long-term overnourishment can be dealt with in 3 days. One only needs to. Su Hao was showing his occupational hazard again. He always liked to design 3 levels for his plans to target the very rich, slightly rich, and ordinary communities. With all this babbling, all the other candidates were completely stunned. They were completely confused listening to it, but the examiners didn't interrupt him but looked deep in thought. Where did such a genius come from? The youth AI Zishi in the front row frowned in thought. His small face was already squeezed together. Therefore, with all that said, this is the reasoning behind my design of this cultivation plan. Su Hao finished and waited for the examiner's judgment. The several deputy examiners nodded slightly. They exchanged a look, seeing both surprise and hesitation in each other's eyes. This plan seems to be reasonable, but only theoretically. How should it be marked? They instinctively turned towards the head examiner. He was an Yushin, deputy president of Yunhua's Association, advanced level sprite cultivator. President An, what do you think?